Imagine you're living in medieval Europe. News has started to spread and illness sweeping through cities, towns, and even rural areas, leaving entire communities to be decimated. Life as you know it begins to change. Daily life during the plague was one of uncertainty, fear, and drastic change. People were forced to adapt to measures that today might feel eerily familiar. For instance, cities and villages imposed strict quarantines, isolating the sick and sometimes even the entire households in an attempt to stop the spread. Some towns created checkpoints and restricted travel, while others simply abandoned entire neighborhoods. In Venice, one of the first formal quarantines was set up in 1348, where ships coming in had to anchor for 40 days before anyone could just set foot on the land. It was from this practice we get the word quarantine, from the Italian word for 40, quaranta. Beyond isolation, public religious rituals and even more extreme forms of penance became common. One of the most striking sights was that of the flagellants, group of people who would march from town to town, whipping themselves as a form of penance, believing that a plague was a punishment from God for human sins. They hoped their suffering would appease divine wrath. Crowds would gather to witness these painful processions, often joining in on prayers for release. Superstitions also ran rampant. People turned to rituals, charms, and folk remedies to protect themselves. Some thought this disease was spread by miasma or bad air, leading to carry sweet-smelling herbs or flowers. Interestingly, this is where some historians believe the children's rhyme, Ring Around the Rosy, might have originated. The rosy refers to the round rash seen on the skin, and the pocket full of posies relates to the herb people carried to ward off the smell of sickness. The plague didn't just alter the everyday life of the people then. It shook the foundations of European society and economy, with mortality rates reaching as high as 50 to 60%. In some regions, labor shortages became a massive issue. Farms were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and there was simply not enough people to work the land. As a result, the labor of the surviving peasants became more valuable. In many cases, peasants and workers could demand higher wages of better working conditions. This newfound bargaining power began to erode the strict feudal hierarchy that had defined European life for centuries. For many, this was the first step towards greater social mobility. However, not all lords were happy with this. In England, for example, laws were introduced to keep the wages as low as possible and to restrict workers from seeking better opportunities. This led to tensions that would eventually culminate in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. The economic effects rippled through the other areas as well. Artisans, merchants, and other city dwellers who survived often found themselves with new opportunities. Some historians even argue that the shortage of labor helped spark innovation as people sought ways to work more efficiently with fewer hands. Property rights also saw unexpected changes. With so many deaths, land and wealth redistributed among the survivors, often empowering women who inherited property from deceased male relatives. It was a tragic but undeniable shift in how society functioned, one that weakened the rigid class structures of medieval Europe. Let's turn now to the medical responses to the plague. This era gave rise to a figure that remains iconic today, the plague doctors. When we picture the plague doctors, we often imagine those eerie beaked masks and dark cloaks. And there's a reason they're so memorable. These beak-shaped masks weren't just for show. At the time, many believed in the miasma theory, that diseases were spread through bad air. Plague doctors stuffed the ends of their beak with aromatic herbs and spices, hoping the pleasant smell would act as a barrier to protect them from the disease. The rest of the outfit, a long wax coat, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat, was meant to cover the doctor from head to toe, preventing any contact with the infected. But what did these plague doctors actually do? Medical knowledge at that time was still limited, so treatment was based on superstition and trial and error. Some doctors used methods like bloodletting, where they would rid the body of bad humors that caused the illness. Others applied poultices made of herbs or vinegar soaked cloths in hope of drawing out the infection. Unfortunately, none of these methods were effective in treating the plague itself, which we now know was caused by a bacterium Yersinia pestis. Despite their limited success, plague doctors played an important role. Many were among the few willing to venture into plague-stricken areas, documenting symptoms and trying to find patterns. In some ways, they were the predecessors to modern epidemiologists working in risky conditions to understand and combat a deadly disease. That's it for today's episode. Join us in the next episode as we dive into the influence of plague on art and literature, the modern perspectives on the plague, and the plague's role in shaping history today. Thank you.